In an earlier episode of Beyond Dramatica, I explored scalability. In other words, how to create smaller stories like children's stories or short stories rather than the full-blown grand argument story that's described in Dramatica. In reviewing that video, I realized there were a couple of points I wanted to make that weren't touched upon in that off-the-cuff report, and so I'll bring them to you now. Briefly, the first thing I want to point out is that on this Dramatica chart of all of these story elements, the periodic table of story elements in Dramatica, down at the very bottom there are little groups of four. Each group of four is a quad, and this little group of four, there's many of them across, as you saw, the entire structure. You can make a story as small as one quad, one group of four items. For example, there's one there that's conscience, temptation, faith, and disbelief. Just those four items, conscience, temptation, faith, and disbelief, at the very bottom of one of these towers. Now that quad alone, you can see that a complete story as far as making an argument could be done using only those four items, conscious, temptation, faith, and disbelief. Much could be said about each one of them and ultimately proving which one is the best way to go in order to resolve the particular problem under study in the story. So rather than having to do a full-blown exploration of not just those items, but all of their ramifications and all of the things that bear pressure upon them as well to make a grand argument story in a full-blown novel or a motion picture, for example, instead you could just deal with those four items directly and cut all the rest of it out. That's about the tiniest story you can make. Tiniest story you can make is four items because it covers all four corners of an exploration regarding a particular kind of problem or a particular kind of issue. Also, another set of four, to give you an example, is a little more esoteric, more in the physical realm of things. It deals with proaction, reaction, inaction, and protection. Those are four different kinds of action that make up an argument. Do you take the initiative in proaction, or do you wait for something to happen and respond in reaction? Or is it better not to take any action at all and let things blow over with inaction, or to realize actions are going to take place and to engage in protection where you prevent them from having an effect on you? Reaction, proaction, inaction, protection, that quad of four items has the same complete little tiny argument for a story that you would find in faith, disbelief, conscience, and temptation. It's the same kind of structural arrangement, the same kind of family, but different areas of concern. One of them dealing with your morality, and one of them dealing with how you respond to threats in the real world. So that is one of the important points I wanted to bring up, is that you can make stories as small as four single items rather than explore all 256 at the bottom, all 64 at the third level down, all 16 at the second level down, and all four at the top, creating a complete grand argument story that explores all of the ramifications in full detail. Okay, the second point that I wanted to make was that this is just a flash photograph, a single moment of a mind. It is like looking at someone's psychology and saying, here it is, right now, just at this moment, let's take a quick shot of it and freeze it, okay? It's in regard, in stories, to just one particular problem. Now, in real life, we all have many problems. Each one can be looked at when we're fully considering it as a complete, full exploration of the mind. But we don't dwell on it. We explore a little bit of it, and then we move on to another problem, explore a little bit, and on to another problem, explore a little bit. And ultimately, we build up a picture of each problem, either to the point that we just stumble across the solution, or to the point that we fully understand the nature of the problem over time. Well, the only problem with that is that over time, these things change. When you explore something and you move on from it, then later on, you come back to another point on the same issue, and the issue may have changed, or the environment in which the issue is becoming a problem or has become a problem may have changed, meaning that it no longer functions with that original data you had. And so that's kind of the fallacy of thinking that we can solve a problem over a period of time, is by the time we get to the end of it, our initial information and explorations may no longer be valid. Stories are different in that way. Once you lock in this flash photograph of the mind's arrangement of issues, and also all the potentials that are there to drive it as it wheels within wheels unfolds over the course of the story, nothing's going to change. It's a closed system. You have everything that's going to be involved, and it's just a matter of playing it out over time. But in the real world, in real psychology, there's no such thing as a closed system, because not only are things changing over time, but also new things are coming to bear. There's really no such thing as a closed system. We all know the butterfly effect. We all know that if a butterfly flaps its wings in China, there may be a storm in New York, okay, because it did. Chaos theory tells us there's no such thing as a closed system. You can hypothesize a closed system, you can use it as a model, and that's what we did in Dramatica, as we said, stories are about closed systems. They're intended to be. They're analogies to life. They are not life, they are about life, and therefore they don't reflect the chaotic influences that happen in life. Instead, they deal with one particular issue and say, in this situation, with things standing as they are at this moment, if nothing changes, here's the best way to go about solving a problem. And so, we have to diverge from real life to use stories. But when you get into real life, what happens with chaos? Well, it turns out there's a couple of ways to deal with chaos in the real world in terms of scalability. And here's where, instead of saying in scalability, we're going to talk about smaller problems. We're going to talk about larger problems. What if the story form, what if the story argument has to become larger than the grand argument story? In other words, bigger than what the human mind can hold inside at one time and still see both the largest parts of the argument and the tiniest details. That's what the scope is of the chart that I showed you. That's the grand argument story. But what if we have to go bigger in order to deal with chaos, where there's two ways to do it? We can go bigger in space, and we can go bigger in time. Now, just as you see in this chart here, right side up helps, if you see in this chart here, each one of these towers, okay, stands alone, but collectively they form a larger quad. What if you had 4 quads made up of this many towers each? Quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, and quad 4. So that you now had 16 of these towers. Well, in that case, you've expanded the size of your closed system. And in so doing, if there are elements outside that realm that will affect the inside, you now have expanded to include those. Of course, the danger is that beyond that, there's still going to be a larger realm, even bigger, where chaos is going to be at work. Chaos is always at work in the areas bigger than your closed system and in the details smaller than you're tracking within your closed system. Chaos can come from within and it can come from without. All right. But if you put enough layers on the outside and enough layers on the inside, you can be pretty sure that in the middle, it's more unlikely that a large chaotic event is going to come in and affect the center of that than if you just are dealing with that one center and saying it's a closed system and chaos is not at work, because then you're going to get it from above and you're going to get it from below. That's one reason the grand argument story is as big as it is, 4 levels, okay? 4 levels high and 4 levels wide, is that it accounts for all the dimensions we can see in the world. Mass, energy, space, and time outside, and thought, knowledge, ability, and desire inside. It's those 8 different dimensions, 4 internal and 4 external, that give us our 4 by 4 map that we have here. Now, one of the problems you have in a story is if you're going to be limiting yourself to a small area and talk just about this, you better not show anything else in any other areas, because stories are not about chaos, they're about order. Stories are about closed system, and true order can only occur in a closed system. There's a bold statement for physics, but I'll make it. Alright, so if you limit yourself to one of these, and then don't put in any story elements from any of the other areas, the audience will buy, or your readers, that this area down here that you're talking about is the scope of your argument, and therefore if anything else is of a concern, you're not exploring that right now, so they'll limit themselves to deciding whether you've made your point within this smaller realm. But if you have a small realm, and you include even one point, or a few small ones outside it, it looks like you're trying to make a larger argument and failing to do so completely. It is far better to make a tiny argument fully explored than to make a larger argument partially explored. Because if you make it partially, the audience, the readers, they'll never buy your point. They'll see all other alternatives that might be explored and you just haven't covered them. You're effectively making a blanket statement instead of an argument. So, stay within your scope of your story. Know what the edges are and stay within it. in terms of time, we talked about space, and we just did that in terms of limiting your scope by space and extending your scope by space. How about time? Well, this is the last point I'd like to make in part 2 here, is that each story form being a flash photograph of the way things are in the mind with all the attached potentials and vectors of change that are going to drive the mind to the next stage. What if you took a flash photograph now, and a flash photograph at the next moment, and then a flash photograph at the next moment, and assembled them like frames in a movie? Well, when you do this, you can begin to see how this closed system would have normally unfolded one particular way, but by the time you get to the next section, it's unfolded in a slightly different way. What made it do that? Nothing inside the closed system. Some other force of chaos, either larger or smaller than the closed system, changed it. And eventually, you move on to the next frame and you see how it's changed again. Now, the thing about chaos is that unpredictability is not necessarily chaos. Chaos happens, as they say on a bumper sticker. But the fact is, have you ever seen one of those pachinko games that has the post sticking out and it's vertical, and you drop balls from the top, and when you drop it in the center, they click all around the sides, and some of them end up on the edges, and some here and some there? Well, one ball might go anywhere. That's chaos. It could go to any side. But a number of balls will always make a bell curve like that, with most of them in the middle and then coming down to the edges like that. That bell curve shows that chaos, that we perceive as chaos because we don't have a system large enough to see it, we're not including it in our closed system, can still have a predictable pattern or shape to it. You just, like the uncertainty principle, can't tell exactly where any given one is going to go, but collectively you can see where they're all headed. As a result of this, if you take this series of movie frames, you can begin to see in the real world when you have a story form that predicts it's going to go from here to here to here, and it's shifting instead to other places as it moves. You can begin to see the curve of that, how it changes as it goes from one side to the other. And in so doing, you can note this kind of bell curve effect and see that the collective impact of all the chaotic events is gradually creating an arc of change to the story form. That arc is predictable, and therefore you can actually, after a number of these movie frames of taking individual story forms, see where it's headed, and you can anticipate where the next point will be. Now, you won't hit it exactly because chaos says you can't, uncertainty principle says you can't, but you'll be within a range, like when they predict where a hurricane's going to land. On a given day, they say it could be here all the way over there. On the next day, it's here, and they say, well, it could be here. Next day, it's here, it could be here. The closer you get to something, the more these movie frames are accurate. The longer a chain, the more you can predict the long-term pattern. The next one you can never predict because it could be up here or down here, but on the average, they will follow a particular line, whether it's a hyperbolic curve or parabolic or just a straight line, linear, exponential, or any kind of curve at all that you can come up with. Those can be predicted using this system. So, in terms of individual psychology, if you want to do a larger story, you might do a story that doesn't actually expand in space to show chaos, but expands over a series of books, like the Harry Potter series, where you show growth of character, where he becomes someone who would not act the same way the original Harry Potter would in the first story. Similarly, in human psychology, you can see in terms of treatment or therapy or following yourself over a period of time how you've changed and become a person that would not react the way that you were as the person you originally were, and by that curve even predict the kind of person you may become, even with the effects of chaos in the long term. Now, that's enough for Scalability Part 2, and we'll catch you next time in another episode of Beyond Dramatica.